All right, hello Farming Secrets community. We are going to be doing another Let's Talk Soil session today. I'm joined with Bryan. Bryan, welcome to the call. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. Yourselves?
Yeah, very good, very good. And I believe you've been around soil for a little bit. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I started dealing with soils back in 1979 and started working with the All-Brick model. And many of you will know the All-Brick model, or some of your past speakers have referred to the All-Brick model. And so I've worked from New Zealand. I worked in New Zealand for many years, and then spent 25 years in Adelaide working around Australia, and 10 years in China, and 10 years in Japan, just working with soils and helping farmers understand their soil problems.
Lovely, excellent. And so I just want to open up the conversation. What does soil mean to you?
What does soil mean to me? Soil means gold, really, because soil is the most valuable mineral, or whatever we want to call it, the most valuable mineral we have in the world. I mean, it's the source of our food, it's the source of our life. What is really the source of being.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I know that you've got a presentation ready to share, so why don't we just jump straight into that and share some of your wisdom about soil with the community.
Okay. Yes, well, today Perfect. I want to talk about understanding pH. And most of us just think if we've got a good pH, then we've got a good soil. So I want to share with you some of the work I've done. And if we can understand our pH, then it's the greatest thing we can do in solving our soil problems. And Dr. Albrecht once stated that if you don't get anything else out of his writings, just understand how your pH is constructed. Just understanding this factor alone will change your entire thinking of soil nutrition. So when we get our soil tests, we tend to, we go and have a look at our pH. Now here this, no matter which lab you go to or whatever lab you use, we look at our pH. But then following the pH, what do we look at next? The next step should be to look at our pH construction. Now that sounds a bit strange to most of you, but understanding the base saturation percentages of calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and hydrogen, understanding these major elements, and they all construct your pH. It's not just lime. If you've got a low pH, people say, "Well, put lime on," but maybe it's something else you need. And we go back and have a look here. You'll see on your soil reports, you'll see anions and cations. And the cations here, don't want to get too technical, but those are the elements that construct your pH. Now let's have a look. So pH, if we understand pH, it's only a measurement of the concentration of hydrogen ions in solution. It has nothing to do with whether you've got a good soil. The pH is a result of the balance of the various major elements, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. And any one of these can give you your pH. Now, working in Australian soils, every state of Australia, the pH are constructed differently. I mean, if we look in parts of South Australia, high calcium is constructing the pH. If you go to some of the soils around Adelaide, you get high magnesium. In New South Wales, you've got high potassium. And of course, around the Murray River, you've got high sodium, all constructing the pH. So good pH must be constructed in the right balance. And that's the important thing we have to understand with our soils. Understanding that is going to give you so much knowledge about your actual soil and understanding your soil. With the right balance of elements, all these elements work together. Or in the wrong balance, they can be antagonistic to each other. And here's the most important thing for you to understand with understanding your pH. Magnesium was 1.66 times more effective than calcium at raising a pH. Potassium is twice as effective at raising a pH. So if you've got high potassium in your soils, that's going to construct your pH. It's not going to construct it the right way. Well, it is the right way, but it's just not going to be a good or constructed pH. And sodium is 4 times. So if you want to raise your pH, just put salt on. A lot more effective than putting lime on. But of course, it won't give you the desire you want in your soil. So once we understand that, these things here, and we look at our soil report, we can see how the different elements will alter our pH. If we understand, and this every lab is slightly different, but if we construct the pH is only related to the to the hydrogen percentage in the soil. It's not related to the balance of the other elements. So we've got calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and other bases like aluminium and some of your trace elements are all positively charged, and they're constructing your pH. And if those are in the right balance, then and you've got a good pH balance right, then all the nutrients, as I say, they're working together. They're working as one, like a team. But if they're constructed wrongly, then the team's out of balance. Now, just quickly here, we have our positives and our negatives. So it's these positive elements here that are constructing our pH. And it's their balance that construct the pH the way we want it. So when you get your soil report, you must look at the whole report. And we can see here, remember, it's hard to remember all this data so quickly, but you see how this pH is constructed. We can see the pH here is a pH of 6, an ideal pH, but it's high, 38% calcium. Remember the 68? It doesn't have to be 68, but that's the ballpark figure. Magnesium set at around 12, 15 is 38. And so we've got this pH is ideal, but here we have a soil which sits like concrete in the summertime. It's muddy and slushy in the winter, and high magnesium soils produce sulfide gas. They produce hydrogen sulfide, which is a greenhouse gas, and that kills off all the microbial activity in that soil. So we have to change the way that pH is constructed, and we'll do that with lime. We haven't got time to go into all that today, but we would lime that, and this soil is actually showing about a 4-ton lime requirement. Here's another lab. This pH is constructed, see, 58% calcium, 10% magnesium. So this is a better soil to work with. It's better to add than to take away, than have to take away. But as we change the balance of these nutrients, like lime, for instance, calcium carbonate, will knock that magnesium off. Here, we need to add calcium and magnesium to get a good pH. This is another lab. And here we've got calcium at 40%, magnesium 31, sodium at 24. So this is a terrible soil. This soil would hardly produce any growth whatsoever. So, but we can change that. We can do what we want to do with that soil. But the important thing when you look at your soil is to look at that pH. Sorry, look at how that pH is constructed. And here we can see, I'll put this in again, just to remember. You won't remember all these figures, and each lab, they have 60 to 70% for calcium, 12 to 15 for magnesium, 2 to 5 for potassium, and so on. But remember, that's how your pH needs to be constructed. You need to look deeper into your soil reports and understanding the 3 aspects of your soil: chemical, physical, and biological. And they're all controlled by the way the pH is constructed. A well-constructed pH, they're all in order. A poorly constructed pH means adverse soil conditions. Doesn't mean you can't do anything about it. When you take your soil, if you understand how your pH is constructed, you can do whatever you want with your soil. You can change it. And that's what I've been doing in the various countries where I've been asked or invited to work, is taking that pH, taking a soil test, finding what the pH is, and then altering the pH to increase the productivity of that soil. As you change the chemical balance, the chemical balance is your magnesium, potassium, sodium ratio, you change the physical condition of that soil. As you increase calcium, decrease magnesium, you open the soil up, and the sodium will leach if you have a sodium problem. And so it's very important. I mean, I've got tests from the banana plantations in parts of the world where crops are failing. They're not failing because of any bacterial infestation or disease. They're failing because their pH is constructed wrongly. And here's a South Australian soil. How we can change it. This was a high magnesium soil, 45% calcium, 36% magnesium, and a pH of 8.9. And calcium magnesium percentages now 71, magnesium 15. And that was a hard setting clay soil. And we opened it up just by changing that pH. And of course, in this particular case, we limed the soil. Now, why would you lime a soil with an 8.9 pH? But it did, because the lime knocked the magnesium off and increased the calcium. Sorry, I didn't put the pH in there. But the pH in this soil actually dropped down to about 7.5. Why did the pH drop? It's because we replaced this high pH forming magnesium with a lower pH forming calcium. So we changed the pH structure. And this is a classic one. This was a work I did with a West Australian land care group. And this is just beautiful. They said we had 4 soil tests here. Here we are. This here is the middle of a salt scald. This is on the edge of a salt scald. This is 50 meters in from the salt scald, into a crop. And there's 100 meters. So here we have the salt scald, and then we have the crop. Now, this is, look here, we've got an 8.3 pH, an 8.1, an 8.4, and an 8.1. So the pHs are basically the same. But the way these pHs are constructed is totally different. This pH here, look, the yellow is salt. So the salt, center of the salt scald where nothing's growing, the pH is constructed with salt. And as we get onto the edge of the, 50 meters from the salt scald, you can see the red is calcium. And as we get 100 meters from the salt scald, we've got more calcium and the sodium has been depleted. So we can see 8.3, 8.1, 8.4, 8.1. The pH is basically the same, but the construction of those pHs is totally different. And that's what we need to look at in our soil tests. Find out how the pH is constructed. And this, of course, will be quite a different view. If you understand this point alone, it's amazing how you can start understanding your pH. When a farmer says to me, I've got a good pH, my first comment is, how is your pH constructed? And after, back in the early 2000s, I did about 200 workshops around Australia. And it was so good to hear the participants saying, how is my pH, or how is your pH constructed? And if you can understand that alone, you'll start to understand your soil. And these are just some of the actual soil tests I've taken. We did all these ones as well, sorry. And we can see the pHs here, 6.2, 6, 6, 5.8. So apart from this one, they're very similar, but here's an ideal one, 63% calcium, 14 magnesium, 42, 4.2, and so on. This one with a 6 pH is 45%, 20%, see? And here we have a 6 pH with only 23% calcium and 32% salt. Here we've got a 7.8 with 32% salt. And here we've got a 5.8 with 51% sodium, salt. The pHs are not telling you the picture of your soil. When you look down here at how that pH is constructed, then you see the picture of your soil. And that's really what it's all about. And this is just a simple showing here. Here's a sample I did March 01 to February 03. And the initial test showed a 6.2 pH and a 6.4 pH. And we look down here, we had 47% calcium, 23% magnesium, 10% sodium. Now, so this was a client. I treated the soil. The calcium went to 47 to 60, 23 down to 15, 10 down to 7. The pH virtually stayed the same, but we had a dramatic change in the way that pH is constructed. And so that's really, really what you've got to do with your soils. So understand your soils. Don't just look at the pH. Look at that pH to see how it's constructed. Understand it in areas like Victoria, from the road from Melbourne to through to Adelaide, you've got lots of pink lakes. And if you took a pH out of those pink lakes, you're going to get a good pH. But nothing's going to grow there. And this was just an on-farm trial where the farmer had a pH of 7.7, calcium was only 30%, magnesium was 38, and sodium was 20. And this farmer, his name was Bryan, same as mine, north of Adelaide. He had a history of an 8-bag crop, 8-bag wheat crop. We applied 2.55 tonne of gypsum and 2.5 tonne of lime. 2 different blocks as a trial. He had a 50% increase where he applied the gypsum. That's a fantastic increase. Where he applied the lime, he had a 125% increase. And the interesting thing is the pH, I don't know if I've got it here. The pH dropped down to 6.7. There it is there. Following year had a pH of 6.7. And he had never achieved this sort of yield in the history of that farm. But once again, just understanding how that pH was constructed solved his problems. So just quickly, we can have our pH constructed with, let's go back, there we go. With excess calcium, and that means we've got, in our complex, we've got a dominance of soil calcium. And if we have too much calcium, then we get a lot of trace element deficiencies and phosphorus deficiencies. And if you're growing farms organically, and there's some, you a lot of difficulty growing good crops on a high calcium soil. If we have excess magnesium, which we talked about, we get this compacted soil, poor root development, etc., etc. And we have this, they produce sulfuric gases and alcohol solutions. There is some good books available explaining all this, but it's just important to understand that you must know how your pH is constructed. If we've got excess sodium, we know, and here's this was a salts gold, and I've shown this picture many times, but this was a salts gold down near Narracourt in South Australia. And here was the analysis. About 44% was calcium and sodium was 36%. Now we actually limed that soil. We didn't mix lime, we only limed the surface. And this was actually 12 months later. The farmer cut it for hay. Now, once again, it was only understanding how that pH was constructed. People don't realize that a salts gold has a high pH or good pH. So we can have, sorry about all these pictures, but there's excess potassium like in Queensland soil. Sorry, let's start again. Excess potassium in the New South Wales soils becomes a problem. You get manganese deficiency and crops lodging. You get excess calcium soils, they exhibit phosphorus deficiency, magnesium, manganese, and a lot of the high calcium soils in South Australia, especially in the west. You get animals chewing on bones. You get manganese deficiency, where sheep are born, animals are born walking on their knees, and that's purely a manganese deficiency in high calcium soils. It's not; they'll eventually come right, but can be a problem with horses. Foals often have to be put down because their joints don't straighten up. Excess magnesium, we get these hard-setting soils, and okay. And here's just some countries I worked in, just to show that this problem is not isolated to Australian soils or New Zealand soils or wherever. So here we have a Botswana soil involved in a project in Botswana with the Botswana government. And we have a 9.4 pH. And you can see here it's just got a dominance of magnesium and a dominance of sodium. And those two elements are giving this, we've got an ideal calcium level. Now this is in Samoa, Western Samoa, and we can see here that we've got a good pH, ideal pH, and they had lots of problems, and I was able to show where you had this excess magnesium. So you got a high magnesium soil. You've got China. I had a lab in China for many years, but here we've got 5.7, and you can see there 38.26, very poorly balanced soil. Western Australia, and this was a potting mix. And one of the gripes I have in countries like Australia is you buy a potting mix, you expect it to be 100% correct. And this was a potting mix which the plant that nothing was surviving, and you can see here it had a 26% potassium, 11% magnesium, and only 12% calcium. So nothing was going to grow in that potting mix. So this is a commercial potting mix being sold out of the garden centre. Now, I've seen this in South Australia, and I've seen it in other states as well. You've got to know what the potting mix is, and you know, that shouldn't be allowed to be sold, but it is. Here's some samples from New Guinea. We can see again there that this is actually not so bad. It's 50% calcium, 11% magnesium. So that's quite an easy soil to correct. Here's a great one out of Victoria. In Australia, we've got 35% calcium, 26 magnesium, and 21% sodium. And see the pH there is 6.5. So that you just look at your pH, say, why won't plants grow here? You got a great pH. And South Australian is a great one. We've got this one's 43% calcium and 13% magnesium, so and a little bit high in sodium. So this is an easier soil to correct. But we have to understand when we correct our soils that one element will suppress another. So in this case, if we just put lime on, we're going to knock magnesium out. So we need to carefully. That's another subject, but not a lot of time today. But you need to be addressing all elements. But in New Zealand, we have a major magnesium deficiency in our soils. And that's because people put lime on without the magnesium. And lime, calcium carbonate, knocks the magnesium out. So you create a deficiency. In excess of one element will always create a deficiency in another. Here's a South Australian soil, which is 81% calcium. And that's a very difficult soil to deal with. And those are some of the soils in South Australia where they use these liquid solution fertilizers. Toowoomba is a great one in Queensland. Got 40% calcium, 50% magnesium, and those heavy black soils. Those soils would set like concrete in the summer and be slushy and muddy in the winter. The soil paddock you walk across, you get taller and taller as you walk across it because the mud's sticking to your boots. Here's another one from Victoria. This is on the Murray River. 40%, 37%, and a 6.8 pH, and 8% potassium. So as we go, this one is an interesting one from Spain. 78%, 10%. You can see it's got an 8.4 pH. Japan with some good soils. Here was one with 90% calcium, 6% magnesium. And so the golden rule is you never lime to construct your pH. I never put lime on to construct a pH. I put lime on to provide calcium only. And that's the golden rule. You put lime on to address your calcium deficiency. And the majority of people are told to lime if you've got a low pH. Now, how do you know you don't need magnesium as well as lime? And how do you know you don't need potassium as well as lime, unless you see how that pH is constructed? And that's the most important issue. Western Australian soils, you know, they're very light soils, like sandy soils. And one client over there once says, why is it when I put potassium on, my pH goes up? Because pH will lift your pH. Potassium will lift your pH. And that's just a matter of understanding. And finally, this is one farm in New South Wales. I work with Mr. Stone there, and this is one of his clients. And we can see here that on this one particular farm, we just put them all up. This one farm, his pH is here of 6. He had 38%, so he had this hard setting soil. Another part of the farm, he had 54-21, so he had a much better soil type, much easier to correct. And on another part, he only had 20% magnesium, calcium, 38% magnesium, so that was a really hard setting soil. If any of you are cricket fans, that's the soil you want for your cricket pitch. It's going to be hard as cement. And some of you know about the Adelaide Oval. We did soil tests in the Adelaide Oval, and the Adelaide Oval soil is like this one, at the cricket pitch. The man in charge there, he brings in the high magnesium soils, and that's what he makes his cricket pitches out of. That's concrete, and we don't want that for our farms. And here we have another 5910, so a much better soil. So even on your own property, between the different types, you can have these different levels of nutrition, or balance, pH balance, I should say. And that's it.
Awesome. Well, thank you very, very much for that. I think it's been very insightful, because I know that a lot of times, people take the pH level as that overarching result, and it's almost like get the test back. And even if you're not doing full soil tests, people are just testing pH with those little self kits. And so I think what you've really shed some light on today is that that's a good start, the fact that you're being curious about pH, but unless you actually know how pH is constructed, that tells a completely different story, because you showed many examples where they were all pHs of 6 or 5.5, and yet the soil profile was very, very, very different. And you could have really good soil and really bad soil and still get a pH of 6. So I think you've shed some really good light.
Australian soils are fantastic.
Yeah.
Australian soils Australia is a fantastic example. You've got all the different states, and every state is different, the way the pH is constructed. So the most important thing, I think, is that when people read literature from another part, they've got to find out, where's that come from? Does it apply to me? Before you do anything about it. And that's what you have to do, is if you understand your pH, go anywhere in the world, you understand the pH, you'll solve problems for whoever you're working with.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. So what got you interested in soil, Bryan?
Well, I guess I had an inquiring mind. I went to Massey University back in 1960. I graduated in 62, 63. That's in Palmerston North, New Zealand. And I had a dairy farm in a place called Cambridge. And I was very curious, because things didn't always go the way they should have. And one of the things I think was we experienced a lot of scouring or diarrhea in our livestock. And I was on a peat farm, and it was copper deficiency, but it was we recognised it before the veterinarians recognised it, and that's not criticising anybody. And so I started inquiring and looking at different aspects, and I just had that. One of the problems when you have a higher education is you always want to look that bit further, and that's probably a limiting factor. But then I got interested, and I was invited, had friends in South Australia, and I got interested and visited South Australia and started working there, and that just grew. And I got interested in the orbit model, and then a group of us formed a laboratory in Adelaide, and then it just expanded. I got invited to go to China, and we set up a lab in China, and that was fantastic. And then got a call from Japan to work in Japan, and Japan work was problem solving, and that's basically what you go into a farm and you look at how you get their soil reports, and you look at the way that pH is constructed, and they think you're a genius. All you've done is look at that pH and how it's constructed, and it's solved many, many problems. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, the sad thing is going on to farms where the farm is losing 60, 70% of its production due to poor soil, and he's been sold fertilizers that don't match his deficiencies or limiting factors. And solving problems is just so. It just gives you that great feeling when you can help that farmer make more money out of it without spending more money.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's just an ongoing thing, and sort of semi-retirement now, but I still get calls to go and visit farms, and soil's the greatest thing in the world, and I love working with dirt.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. And I think you make a really good point there, where, working with farmers and seeing their enterprise turn around from going back to basics and going back to a more natural system. And so I'm assuming you get to go and spend a lot of time on different farms. When you walk onto a farm, what's a tell sign that the soil isn't healthy? Is there some things that you can tell straight away that others could possibly look for to see that whether their soil isn't healthy?
Yeah, I guess the first thing when you walk onto a farm is not to say too much, because you really got to ask questions. You got to listen, ask questions, and listen, and don't make any assumptions until. A great example was I went onto a farm in Japan where the farmers' asparagus was failing, and I can't bring up any photos of that, but the asparagus was growing like bananas, and it had cuts in it as if it had been cut with a knife. And of course, the obvious one was the farmer was blaming the seed. So he was ready to punch the lights out of the guy who supplied him the seed. And while they were arguing, I dug around the plant, and the soil, you've got to look at the soil, and the soil was all blocky, and it had rained for 12 hours and the soil was still dry. And that's sort of a telltale story. There's something wrong with that soil. And so it was a matter of the soil tests. I got the soil tests. I gave the farmer some advice straight away, but I got the soil test back, and he had hardly any. It was about 40% calcium and about 30-40% magnesium. So it was a soil which was just not functioning, and the pH was good. But the thing was that when you've got, and the other problem was, and this is another subject, but they had put about 100 mils probably of compost on the soil. The asparagus is trying to grow, and while the asparagus is trying to grow, the compost has been decomposed. And the soil, while they're decomposing the compost, won't supply any supplements to the plant. So the plant was going phosphorus deficient, which was this banana-shaped asparagus. So I actually and I put extra nitrogen on, now only because of the compost, to help the bacteria break down, or the microorganisms break down that compost. And that farmer was losing 70% of his crop. So within a week, the asparagus was coming up straight, just because I helped the microbes get rid of that compost. And the other thing was, he had when you got cuts in your asparagus, it's a calcium boron deficiency. We sprayed boron on. I got him sprayed boron, and within 3 days, all those cuts had disappeared. So you can go onto a farm and you just look around, look at the soil. And the other thing, of course, is the most important thing, and that you've mentioned in some of your past things, is to smell the soil. And if the soil smells putrid, there's something wrong. But if it's got a nice, sweet, that nice potato smell, it's functioning. And it was, so you see all these I showed them all these Japanese guys with a handful of soil smelling their soil, and it's quite a. It's just such an interesting thing to see that realize that that's the problem.
Yeah.
And so it's a matter of investigation, looking at the soil, asking if they've got any soil tests. But and I was in this particular case. I mean, I told the farmer it's nothing to do with the seed. It was a fertilizer supplier's fault. He was supplying and the fertilizer supplier was standing there, but I had no hesitation in telling the fertilizer supplier it was his fault. Applying the wrong fertilizers.
Yeah.
And
all too common from what I hear. And I love the fact that you bring this back to using our senses, visual, smelling, the touch, the textures of the soil. So I think, we've been gifted these senses, and we should use them more wisely, and supporting that with soil tests, and, not assuming anything, I think is a really good tip as well, because on the surface, it could look like it was the seeds problem, but, after a bit of investigation, you can very easily rectify where the cause was coming from.
Yeah, because people don't realize you can change the taste, the density, the flavor, the taste, and the storage life of whatever you're dealing with, just by looking at that way that pH is constructed, and dealing with those limiting factors. I mean, you can take a tomato grower in South Australia we started working with. He was sending his tomatoes to Sydney, and the Sydney buyers at the market says, your tomatoes are terrible, you've got to sell them quick. Within 3 weeks, he got a phone call saying your tomatoes are now so good that we can keep them till last, because their keeping quality is so good. And all we did was look at the soil, identify the limiting factors, and then get the farmer to address those limiting factors. The problem is that many farmers do what their neighbours have done, or they do what they've done for 50 years or 20 years or 10 years. They do the same thing every year. And really the program should change every year to look at those limiting factors. There's no problem.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Bryan, it's been absolutely a pleasure talking all things soil with you today. Thank you for imparting all the wisdom to our community. I know from myself, I had a lot of aha moments as you were going through your presentation, and you know, someone who's been around, you know, this space for a little while, it's always, you know, it is really refreshing to hear the way that you've taken this approach. And I think a lot of people will have that same aha moment. So I really thank you for talking soil with us today.
Pleasure.
Excellent,
Great.
excellent. Well, Farming Secrets community, you know, feel free to reach out and ask more questions. Bryan has been very gifting with his time, and I know that there's a few more things in the pipeline that we will work out with Bryan. So watch this space. Make sure that you're getting all our updates, and we will spend more time with Bryan and other soil experts over this series of getting to know your soil better. So thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in. Until next time, get your hands dirty in the soil and get to understand your soil.